Welcome to Velvet Chronicles, where every secret changes destiny. Tonight's story begins. A duke who never smiled, a seamstress who saw everything, and one guinea that changed a family forever. This is the untold Regency love story of grief, secrets, and the quiet courage of an ordinary woman who mended more than gowns. Eleanor Ashcombe had repaired 9 gowns in the Ravensmere assembly rooms that Hallowtide night. 4 of them twice. She could not see all the dancers from where she sat, and she did not need to, she knew them by sound alone. The retiring room was a narrow closet off the passage, with a looking-glass, 2 chairs, a jug of water gone cold, and the smell of tallow and violet powder hanging thick in the air. Eleanor kept the chair nearest the door, where the light fell best. Her workbox sat open on her knees, needles in the lid, a paper of pins, her scissors on their black ribbon, and in the small compartment at the front, her mother's silver thimble, worn thin on one side from 30 years of pushing thread. Mrs. Whitfield had sent a hand to every assembly in Ravensmere for 22 years. Hems came down. Flounces were trodden through by men who could not count their steps. A lady who had paid for guineas for a gown would not sit out half an evening for one torn breadth, and she would remember for years whose girl had mended it. 6pence for the night, and supper if the servants remembered. Eleanor had been that hand for 5 years. The door to the ballroom stood a little open at the end of the passage. Through it drifted the smell of hot wax and hothouse flowers, the shuffle of 30 pairs of feet, and the 2 fiddles and cello that Ravensmere kept in place of an orchestra. The cello was flat, and always had been, and every year the stewards paid the man his guinea and said nothing about it. That was the whole of Eleanor's place in the world. She heard the flat cello, and she knew which of the laughing ladies beneath the chandelier had put the same silk through her hands 3 seasons running. She knew all of it. Nobody knew her. At 10:10 the door banged open and Miss Winterbourne came in on one heel, her mother close behind holding up 2 feet of ruined lilac flounce in her fist. Trodden, Mrs. Winterbourne said, by a man with feet like a cart horse. Can it be saved? Let me look, mother. Eleanor knelt on the boards. She did not ask Miss Winterbourne to sit, because Miss Winterbourne would not have sat. Ladies stood in the retiring room and carried on the conversation they had left behind in the other one. The tear was clean, 3 inches above the hem, in a soft Italian net that would take an invisible repair if the light stayed poor, and the ballroom light was always poor. 50 candles, and Ravensmere thought itself splendid. 8 minutes, Eleanor said. 8. You hear that, Mamma? I hear it. She threaded her finest needle by feel, because looking up would have cost her a second, and began. Her hands did the work. Her ears did everything else. And of course, they will not receive her now, Mrs. Winterbourne was saying above her head. One does not, after a thing like that. I am sorry for her, and I say so freely. But there is such a thing as the standard of a place. She looked very ill, Miss Winterbourne murmured. She has had a great deal to bear, and borne none of it well. Hold still, child. I am holding still. It is the girl who moves. Eleanor drew the net together stitch by stitch, so small the thread vanished into its own shadow, while 30 feet away the 2 women discussed another woman entirely, one wearing a gown Eleanor had remade that spring from her mother's own wedding silk. The family had fallen in the world, they could not buy new and would not be seen without it. For days of work had gone into matching those breadths so carefully that even by daylight one had to look twice. Nobody had looked twice. They had simply known, the way a county always knows. There, Eleanor said, and bit the thread. Miss Winterbourne turned before the glass, shook the flounce, searched for the mend, and could not find it. Mrs. Winterbourne left 6pence on the corner of the washstand rather than in Eleanor's hand, in the voice one uses for a clever dog, and swept out. Eleanor picked the coin up herself. She had long ago learned not to mind that particular slight, and she still minded it, and both were true at once. At 11 the whole passage changed its sound before she understood why, the fiddles going on, the feet stopping, 40 voices dropping half a tone together, the way a room drops when someone unexpected walks into it. Sarah Milbrook, the nursery maid from the vicarage, put her head round the door with her eyes very wide. "He's come," she said. "Blackmore." Standing in the doorway this minute, Mr. Hargrove brought him in. "The stewards have gone the colour of boiled linen. 14 months, and never once out of that house, and he walked in at 11. Eleanor set down her needle. She had never laid eyes on the new Duke of Blackmore, and almost nobody had. His elder brother had been a fixture of the county for 12 years, broad, loud, well-loved, the man who opened the Ravensmere subscription ball every autumn. Until he drowned the June before last at Hollow Ford, his wife beside him in the carriage, the water 4 feet over the crossing stones. They had been driving home from a dinner. 7 miles round by the bridge, or a quarter mile through the ford. The coachman had said the water was high. The Duke had said the water was always high. 2 hours later a hayrite found the carriage lamp on its side in a willow 40 yards downstream, still burning. The one detail the county could never leave alone. They had left behind a daughter of 8, and a younger brother nobody had seen in 9 years, because he had spent that time in Cumberland, working as another man's land agent for £240 a year. That was the whole of what Ravensmere knew of Nathaniel Ashworth, and Ravensmere had been chewing on it for 14 months. Eleanor went to the door, because everyone in the building went to a door. She did not go far. She stood in the passage in her plain black gown, the colour Mrs. Whitfield's hands wore to be a shadow, and looked down 30 feet of candlelight into the ballroom. He was tall and did not stoop, which somehow made him look worse rather than better, because a stooping man has at least decided to be sorry about it. Dark hair cut close, going grey faintly at the temples. Fine cloth, London cut, entirely plain, worn by a man who did not know what to do with his own hands. The stewards descended on him in a body, he answered each in a few words. He danced once, correctly and joylessly, with a viscount's daughter, then stood at the wall with his hands behind his back, and never once smiled. What Eleanor noticed was not the absence of the smile. It was that between the figures of the dance, when the line held still, he looked twice toward the doors. The way a man looks at a door when he has promised someone he will stay until a certain hour, and is counting the minutes until he may leave. The supper room at Ravensmere was the long cold chamber at the north end of the hall. By a quarter past midnight it held the wreckage of the evening, cut ham, a trifle gone to soup, 20 empty glasses, for candles left of 30, and the smell of cold gravy. Eleanor went in because the jug in the retiring room had stood empty an hour and every servant had gone down to eat. The Duke of Blackmore stood at the end of the table with his back to her, entirely alone, doing nothing at all. There was no way to leave unheard, so she did what she had been taught at 17, she became furniture. "There is water in the blue jug," he said, without turning. "I have already looked." "Thank you, Your Grace." He turned. Grey eyes, the colour of the estuary at Hollow Ford in February, and a face younger than she had expected and far more tired. He studied her as though solving something. "You are the one from the passage. With the box?" "Yes, Your Grace." "You have been in that chair since 8. She had. She had not imagined that anyone on the far side of that door had noticed, and the fact that he had ran through her strangely, like cold water on a bad tooth. "There is generally work, Your Grace." "What work?" She was too tired to soften it. A flounce trodden through. 2 hems let down where the ladies have grown. A shoulder seam split in the reel. She lifted the work box an inch. And a sleeve where a lady caught her bracelet and cried, because it was new. "And you make them right." "I make them so nobody can see where they went wrong." "It is not quite the same thing." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, but the place where one might have lived, on a man who still had one about him. "Say that again," he said. She looked up. In her whole life she had spoken to perhaps for men above the rank of a shopkeeper, and never at a quarter past midnight, and never like this. "I make a thing look as though nothing ever happened to it. That is all mending is, Your Grace. The tear is still there. You simply cannot find it." "Does it always hold?" "No." "When does it not?" When it is put under weight, she said. A repair bears ordinary wear for years. It will not bear being pulled. If you pull, it fails at the mend, because the mend is the only part of the cloth that has already been broken once. The town clock struck the half hour. He turned his head toward it. Midnight, he said, mostly to himself. That will do. He set his glass down precisely in the center of a wine ring. Good night. You should be paid double for this evening. You will not be. And he went, and she heard his boots the length of the passage, then the front doors, then a carriage on the cobbles going north toward Blackmore Hall. To understand what Eleanor Ashcombe did with the rest of that autumn, one must go back 7 years, to a bow window on the Ravensmere Market Square. Her father, Thomas Ashcombe, had kept a linen draper's shop there since before the turnpike. A narrow storefront, a brass rail across the glass, an oak counter gone black where 2 generations of hands had rested. A mild, exact man, he removed his hat for the poorest woman who came in for a yard of dowlas. Her mother, Alice, did the fine work in the room behind, apprenticed at 14 in Bath, able to set a sleeve better than any woman in 3 counties. She taught her daughter by putting the work in front of her and saying nothing until it was wrong. Eleanor was 6 for her first hem, 9 when she sewed her first real seam on a real gown for a real customer, her mother standing behind her with folded arms the whole while. That will do, she said at the end, the highest praise that room ever gave. A lung complaint took her father slowly through the winter she turned 13. For years of it, a doctor from the next town at 7 shillings a visit, the shop stock thinning every season because cloth cannot be bought with money already given to a physician. He died the March she turned 17. The shop went in June to a man who put a milliner in it, and the old oak counter went for firewood, which Eleanor never quite forgave and never once mentioned aloud. Her mother lived another year and a half, sewing until 5 days before the end, sitting up in bed with the work on her knees, because the money in the house was what her hands made and there was no other kind. Eleanor buried her in November and walked into Mrs. Whitfield's on the Monday following. You want a place? Mrs. Whitfield had asked. I want work. A place is bed and board and being told what you are. Work is neither. Show me your hands. She had shown them. Mrs. Agatha Whitfield, then 58, had buried a husband and a business in London before ever coming north. She turned the hands over, studied the callus beside the second finger. Alice Ashcombe's daughter, she said. 8 shillings the week, and you eat here. If you cry in my workroom, you may cry quietly. That had been 5 years past. Eleanor had cried in that workroom exactly twice, quietly, and both times Mrs. Whitfield had set a cup of tea at her elbow without a word and gone on cutting. What remained of her mother was the thimble, and the sample book, a marbled ledger, once her father's, stitched at the corner with a single tacking thread. Into it went a finger's width of every gown that had passed through Eleanor's hand since she was 14, and beside each scrap, in pencil, 3 lines, what it had been, what it became, who wore it. It was not sentiment. A woman who remakes gowns must recall, for years on, whether a breadth has already been turned once, for it can only be turned once more. The book was her memory, and, though she would never have used the word, it was also the only record left of 8 years of her life. The morning after the assembly, Ravensmere spoke of nothing else, and by 9 the workroom above the shop had heard it all. He came in at 11 and left at 12, said the apprentice, Nora, who had it from her brother, who had held the horses. He took no supper, and spoke to the stewards in fewer than 2 words. They say he is proud, Nora added, with relish. 9 years an agent up north, and now he sits in that great house with the shutters closed and won't see a soul. They say the little girl doesn't speak at all. Mrs. Winterbourne says the rain is proud when it falls on her, said Mrs. Whitfield, without looking up. Turn that hem. Eleanor's needle went on. She said nothing of the supper room, and did not intend to. There is a species of thing a woman in her place learns never to speak aloud, because in other mouths it becomes something else entirely. They say, Mrs. Whitfield repeated, snapping her shears shut, is the busiest family in England. My cousin's girl is in that nursery, and the child speaks perfectly well when she chooses, which is not often, and is nobody's business. And the Duke sat with his brother's coffin 2 nights running and would not let them close the lid until the sister came from Bath. If any of you calls that pride, you may go and be proud in the street. The room fell into the silence it kept perhaps twice a year. Sit down, Nora. Not you, Eleanor. Come here. She held a letter, opened, its seal broken carefully rather than torn. From Blackmore Hall, she said, by the hand of Mr. Hargrove, their steward, who writes like a man charged by the word. Read it. You will be going, so you may as well know why. It requested Mrs. Whitfield's attendance at Blackmore Hall the following Thursday, and asked that she bring a person capable of taking measurements and exercising patience. Mourning for the late Duke and Duchess was to be set aside at Hallowtide, by direction. Lady Margaret Ashworth had grown 3 inches and possessed nothing that was not black. A second paragraph, shorter, the hand pressed harder into the page, the order was to be complete by the 18th of November, morning dresses, a pelisse, a bonnet, gloves, shoes, and 1 good gown fit for a child to be seen in by a gentleman coming down from London on the business of the Court of Chancery. Chancery, Eleanor said. Mrs. Whitfield folded the letter along its old creases. The aunt has moved. Mrs. Cavendish, of Bath, the late Duchess's own sister. She has petitioned to have the child's care put into her own hands. Can she do such a thing? She can ask. Anyone may ask. The child is a ward of the court now, and the court is a room in London with a man in it who has never seen Blackmore Hall and never will. What he will have instead is a report. Someone will come down, look at that house, and write what he sees. On what he writes, that child goes to Bath, or stays where she is. And what will he see? A house with the shutters up and the clock stopped. A duke who has spoken to no one in 14 months, and a little girl who won't say good morning to a stranger. And a man in London will read it over his breakfast and think, quite reasonably, that the aunt sounds a very sensible woman. She took up her shears again. Thursday. Wear the grey. And Eleanor, bring your book. Blackmore Hall stood for miles north of Ravensmere at the end of a limewood avenue that someone was still keeping in order, swept, verges cut, the park wall repointed within the year, the lodge windows clean. And every shutter on the front of the house closed. 32 windows of warm brown stone, the colour of a fresh loaf, catching the light of a fine October morning, and behind every pane the white painted inside face of a shutter, folded and barred. They have not opened the front room since the funeral, Mrs. Whitfield said. Don't stare. It gives them the advantage. Mrs. Winslow, the housekeeper, a small dry woman of 60 with a face like a closed account book, led them through a stone passage into the great hall. And Eleanor understood within 4 seconds that this house was not what the county believed. It was not ruin. It was immaculate. Polished floors, square chairs, not a cobweb, not a drift of soot, not one dead lamp, and the whole vast room smelled only of beeswax and cold stone. No flowers. No gloves left on a table. No letters, no book set face down. Nothing suggested a living soul had crossed that hall since it was built. Above the stairs, the tall case clock stood with its hands fixed at 6:20. Eleanor looked a second too long. They are all like that, said Mrs. Winslow, without turning. The one in the hall, the one on the stairs, the 2 in the drawing-room, the stable clock. 6:20, the hour the man came up from the ford. We stopped them that night, as is proper. A pause, exactly 1 beat long. Nobody has given an order to start them since. 14 months, Mrs. Winslow, said Mrs. Whitfield. 16, said Mrs. Winslow. This way. The nursery sat at the top of the east side, the only room with its shutters open. Someone had thought of that much, at least. A fire, a rug, books, a doll's cradle, a globe worn bare of varnish over the whole of Cumberland. Lady Margaret Ashworth stood at the window, her back to the door, small for 9, black frock, black ribbon, black stockings, a great deal of dark hair brushed with more duty than love. She did not turn when the door opened, nor at her own name. She stood exactly where she was, forehead nearly touching the glass, one hand gripping the other wrist. The room arranged itself around that small black back the way a family gathers round a sickbed. She will not stand for it, Mrs. Winslow said, to the room in general, the way one repeats a fact already reported many times. Not for the shoemaker in July, nor the hairdresser. We have tried firmness. How very unusual, said Mrs. Whitfield. Eleanor set her box on the table and did not approach and did not speak the child's name. She unwrapped the tape, the paper of pins, and then the marbled ledger, worn white at the corners, and opened it flat in the light, and began, quite deliberately, to turn its pages as though alone in the room. A ledger turned makes a heavier sound than an ordinary book. Behind her, Mrs. Whitfield began asking Mrs. Winslow about linen presses, a kindness, meant as one. Eleanor turned another page. A hand's width of striped dimity, a curtain at the parsonage, made into a morning dress, worn 2 seasons. The child's feet made no sound on the rug, what Eleanor heard was breath arriving at her elbow. She did not look down. She turned another page. That is a book of pieces, said a voice, very small, very clear, entirely level. It is. Why? Because I cannot carry 8 years of cloth in my head. If I forget what a gown once was, I might cut it wrong the second time. Lady Margaret considered this with her uncle's eyes and an expression of great, permanent seriousness. What are the small writings? 3 lines under every piece. What it was, what it became, who wore it. I never write anything else. Why not? Because the rest is not mine to write down. The child looked at her a long moment with nothing childish in her face at all, then put her hand flat on the page. Turn them back. They travelled backward through 5 years, a Christmas gown of green sarcenet remade into 2 spencers, a black bombazine sewn for one funeral and let out for another. On the 4th page from the front, Lady Margaret's hand stopped. The scrap was blue, deep and quiet, faded a little along one edge where it had lain in a window, a line of fine cording worked into it in the same shade, so faint one had to hold it to the light to find the pattern. The child said nothing for a long moment. That is my mother's. Yes. You are not to say it is not, because I know it. I would not say it. She had it at Christmas, and when the painter came, and when the small voice closed and started again somewhere safer. It is your mother's. She sent it to us in the November of that year, Eleanor said, because the sleeves were an old shape and she did not want a new gown. I took the sleeves out, cut them narrow, corded the neck to use the extra stuff. She came herself for the fitting and stood on that very stool without one complaint, which very few ladies manage. What do the 3 lines say? Eleanor read them aloud, because they had been written to be read. Was a blue silk. London made, sleeves of the old shape. Became a blue silk with narrow sleeves and corded neck. Worn by Her Grace the Duchess of Blackmore. She paused. There is a 4th line beneath it. I have broken my own rule only the once. What does it say? It says she took her own shawl off the chair and put it round my shoulders, because the room was cold. The nursery went very quiet. At the far end, Mrs. Whitfield had stopped speaking of linen presses some time before. Lady Margaret stood with her hand on the page, her jaw set exactly like a woman of 40 determined not to make a scene in company. You may measure me, she said, if you are quick. Eleanor was quick, measuring her at the window in the good light, calling out every figure aloud as she took it, because there is nothing on earth so unbearable to a child as being discussed over her own head. 22 inches, 15 from neck to waist behind, 3 inches more than the black frock allowed. It had been pulling the child's shoulders forward for half a year, and no one in that great clean house had noticed. You have outgrown everything you own, Eleanor said. That is not carelessness. It is only what 9 does. Aunt Cavendish says I am neglected. The tape stilled half a second and went on. Does she? She said it in the hall, in the summer, to Mr. Hargrove. she said, look at the child, she has been neglected. And then she was crying when she said it. And then she gave me a workbox with a mother-of-pearl lid. A pause. I do not like the workbox. I like my aunt. Those are two different things, and everyone keeps making them one. So they do, Eleanor agreed. Turn round, please. Chin up. It was at that moment, tape at the child's shoulders, that Eleanor looked past her into the doorway. The Duke of Blackmore stood there. She did not know how long. Long enough. One hand on the frame, and he had not come in. His face wore the look she had once seen on a man in the market square in a hard winter, watching a baker carry a tray of loaves past him. Not grief, closer to hunger. He saw that she had seen him. He took his hand off the frame. Go on, he said, please, and stood in that doorway the rest of the fitting, for minutes, without another word, while his brother's daughter told a dressmaker her own waist measurement with her chin up. Nathaniel Ashworth went down the back stairs afterward, not the front, a thing he did often, in his own house, and knew it. Mr. Wren's letter had arrived on Tuesday and still lay on the estate room desk, weighted with a piece of drainage tile, because he had read it 6 times and had not yet answered. Wren was a good man who told the truth in the plainest words available. The petition of Mrs. Cavendish would be heard in the Michaelmas sittings or shortly after. The master would not decide on affidavit alone in a matter touching an infant, and would direct an inquiry. A gentleman to attend at Blackmore Hall, see the house and the child, and report. I am to tell you frankly what he will look for, Wren wrote. The ordinary furniture of a family life, judged in one evening on what he can see, hear, and be told at your own table. And the paragraph Nathaniel had read most, your position is not weak in law. Your brothers will name you and no other. It is weak in appearance. You are unmarried. You have not dined in company since the title came to you. You are known in the county chiefly as a man who is not known. Mrs. Cavendish has a husband, a house, a pew, and a great deal of natural feeling. Forgive me, she has a life, and you have an estate. He stood with his hands on the back of a chair in the one room of that house he used. Desk, for ledgers, a map of the property, a window he opened every morning in any weather, a chair with a broken arm he had mended himself with wire, because he had spent 9 years in a country where a man mends his own chair. He knew every field on that map by its rent and its drainage, had walked every acre in 14 months, had put £900 into new ditching and got the old mill running again. Not one tenant would say a word against him. He could not sit in a room with a stranger for 4 hours. That was the whole of it, and no arrangement of words made it better. He had gone to the Hallowtide Assembly precisely to try, because Wren had written you must be seen, and had lasted an hour and a half counting the doors. The only conversation in the whole building that had gone anywhere had been for minutes in a cold supper room with a woman mending other people's clothes. He rang, a thing he almost never did, and asked Mrs. Winslow what the dressmaker's assistant was paid for a day's work, and to mention the question to no one. Mrs. Winslow, in that house since he was a boy, looked at him a moment too long for strict respect. 3 shillings the day, your grace, and her dinner. Thank you. May I ask what your grace intends? No, he said, because I do not know yet, and if I say it aloud before I know it, I shall not do it. The fitting fell on the 16th of October, in the small room at the end of the north passage, chosen for its cold good light and long table. It had been the late Duchess's morning room, no one said so, and Eleanor knew it within a minute. The work basket still sat on the little table by the chair, a piece of white work in it, needle still through the cloth, the thread gone brown. 16 months, and someone dusted round it every week. She did not touch it, laid out her pattern papers at the far end, and got on. He came in at 4, when the light was going, and stood just inside the door without coming further, like a man who had learned the place where he was not master. Miss Ashcombe, I want to ask you something, and I am going to do it badly. I have thought for a fortnight how to do it well. There is no well. Eleanor put down her shears. On the 18th of November a gentleman comes from London, a Mr. Whitmore, on the business of the court. He will look at this house, at my brother's daughter, at me. He will sit at my table from 7 until midnight, and afterward write down what he found. A pause. My solicitor tells me the whole matter turns on that evening, and I have decided to believe him. Yes, Your Grace. I cannot do it. He said it the way another man might report a fallen tree across a road. I can talk to a tenant, a mason. 9 years I talked to men about water and rents and lime, and was thought civil enough in Cumberland. I have not sat at a table in company since the June before last. I have found that I cannot begin, and that if a silence runs past a certain length I would sooner walk from the room than break it. I have walked out of rooms in my own house. His jaw moved. I should like to hire you for one evening. Here. 7 until midnight, the same hours. You would sit in the drawing room with your work. I do not suppose you can sit 5 hours with your hands idle any more than I can. You need not entertain me. You need not be clever. I want to discover whether I can be a man in a room with someone in it for 5 hours, and I would rather learn it where it costs nothing. The light was nearly gone. Somewhere down the passage a door closed. A guinea, he said. That is not a wage. It is a fee, and I am aware of the difference. You may refuse. If you refuse, my niece's order stands exactly as it is, and I shall not mention this again, to you or anyone. Eleanor stood very still, her hand on the cold table. She thought of the sixpence on the washstand, and of a man counting doors at an assembly. She thought, unwillingly, of a needle gone brown in an unfinished piece of white work 10 feet away. You have told me what it is not, she said. May I ask what it is? Am I to be a lady in your drawing room, Your Grace? No. Then what? There is the difficulty. I have not had a person in a room since June of last year, only staff, my brother's child, men about drains. I do not know whether the fault lies in the house or in me, and I cannot learn it alone. And if I learn it lies in me, he said, I would rather know it by midnight on a Thursday than on the 18th, in front of a stranger from London, with my brother's daughter asleep upstairs. Eleanor looked at him a long moment. Thursday, then, she said. Mrs. Whitfield did not shout, which was somehow worse. A guinea, she said, for an evening's sitting with your work. She set the flat iron back on the stove with great care, in that workroom, the equivalent of another woman hurling it across the floor. A wage is 3 shillings and a dinner, and nobody in Ravensmere has ever told a story about 3 shillings and a dinner in their lives. He was perfectly plain about it. I have no doubt of his plainness. It is the only comfort in this whole business. She sat down, which she did about as often as she raised her voice. Now attend. You will not be ruined that evening. You will be ruined afterward, by degrees, by women who never say a word to your face. I know it. You do not know it. You are 22. I sat on the floor of an assembly and mended a flounce while 2 women talked over my head about another woman's ruin, Eleanor said, sitting opposite her. A thing she had never once done. Nobody in that building looked at me all night but him. He asked what I did, and listened to the answer. Her hands lay still in her lap. I am not a fool. I know what he is and what I am, and I know precisely what this town will make of a guinea. I am going anyway. Mrs. Whitfield studied her a long while. Your mother had that same voice, she said at last. Twice in her life, and both times she was right, and both times it cost her. She took the iron up again. Wear the grey. Take the good scissors. And Eleanor, home by 1, and walk in at the front of this shop, not the back. If you creep, they will know there is something to creep about. She arrived at 7. Blackmore Hall that Thursday had one thing about it Eleanor had never seen. The drawing-room shutters stood open, candles burning in the windows. From the turn of the avenue the front of the house showed 2 squares of yellow light, like a face that had opened its eyes. 19 candles in the drawing-room, which she counted later out of pure nerves. A chair on each side of the hearth, a small table beside each, on one a decanter and glass, on the other, placed where nothing could have set it there by accident, a branch of 3 candles arranged for close work. He had thought of the light a sewing woman would need, and mentioned it not at all. They dined first, in a small room meant for 4, 2 footmen present under orders that said nothing about what to do with their faces. It was very bad. He asked whether the road from Ravensmere had been dry. She said it had. He asked whether she took wine. She said not usually. A silence of perhaps 12 seconds while the soup was cleared. This was going to be a catastrophe, and they had 4.5 hours of it left. "Your Grace," she said, "may I say something out of my place?" "I should be obliged." "Send the men away." He looked up. "They stand behind you," Eleanor said, "and every time you begin, you hear one breathe, and you stop. I have been in service, in one way or another, all my life, and I know that sound. There is no one in this house who does not already know exactly what I am and what you have paid me. Their standing here protects neither of us. It only makes a play of it. 1 second, 2, 3. Both of you," the Duke said. "Go and have your supper. Leave the dishes and shut the door." They went. The room seemed to double in size. "Better," he said, "considerably." "Now what?" "Now nothing, Your Grace. We eat the mutton." They ate it in a quiet that lasted 3 or 4 minutes and was not agony. "That was easier," he said afterward, in the tone of a man noting a measurement. "Yes," said Eleanor, and neither made anything more of it. At 8 they moved to the drawing room, and she took out her work, and the evening changed. She had brought Lady Margaret's pelisse in a moss-green merino. The child had chosen herself from 9 patterns after 20 minutes of the most serious deliberation Eleanor had ever witnessed. She threaded up, set the candle branch to her liking, and began felling the lining down the front edge. A small steady sound that settled into the room and stayed. He sat with a book he did not read. "I did not know," he said after a while, "that it made a noise. I have been in rooms with sewing women all my life and believed it a silent occupation. It is not. There is the thread through the cloth, and now and then a small click, like a coal settling. The thimble on the needle's eye. Yes. Twice or 3 times a stitch, if the cloth is heavy. You could tell, from the passage, how many women in my mother's workroom were behind on their work." "How?" "Because a woman behind her work sews faster than she breathes, and it goes ragged." He was quiet a while after that, but a different quality of quiet. She left a gap without letting it become a hole, a thing 5 years in fitting rooms had taught her. "You were 9 years in Cumberland," she said. "What did you do there?" "Not the title of it." "The days." And the Duke of Blackmore, who had counted the doors at the Hallowtide Assembly, talked for 40 minutes about drainage, a bog above a hillside thought worthless for 200 years, and the 2 months he had spent walking it with a spade to find where the water entered, the day they cut the first main drain and the whole hill began, quite audibly, to run, the 17 families on that ground, and what their rent had been before and after. He talked like a man let out of somewhere. "I am boring you very badly," he said at last. "You are not. You have said more in 40 minutes than in the whole of the rest of our acquaintance, and none of it was the weather." Eleanor turned the pelisse in her hands. "May I make an observation?" "Yes." "You are not a man who cannot talk. You are a man who cannot talk about nothing. Those are different afflictions, and only one of them is serious. At 10 the fire wanted making up, and he did it himself, which no duke in the county would have done. A man who has been an agent knows the difference between a fire and a bonfire. Kneeling there, tongs in hand, back to her, he said, "I was in Cumberland when they came for me." Eleanor's needle stilled. 2 men rode north from the ford that night, and Hargrove sent a letter by the 6 o'clock mail, and it reached me on the Friday at noon. I was in a field. He set a coal in place. I had not seen my brother in 5 years, no quarrel in it. He wrote twice a year, I answered twice a year. He was 10 years older, and he had all this. I had a horse, a dog, a very good cottage with a slate roof. I believed, truly believed, that I had the better bargain, and that we both knew it. Your Grace, let me finish it. I have never said it in order before. He set down the tongs. I came south in 2 days. When I arrived they had them in the chapel. The sister had not yet come from Bath, and the undertaker's man wanted to close the lids for the weather. I would not let him. 2 nights I sat there. I have been asked since what I was thinking, and never answered, because the answer is that I was thinking nothing at all. I was waiting for it to be a mistake. The fire ticked. Somewhere above them a floorboard settled, the way old houses do. Then they brought the child down. She had a cold. That is the whole reason my brother's daughter is alive. Her mother had said she might not go out with that cough, and thought it a nuisance at the time. She stood in the chapel doorway in her nightgown and looked at me, a man she had seen perhaps 4 times in her life, and said, "Are you the uncle?" I said yes. And she said, "Then you had better come upstairs, because they have all been crying and nobody has put me to bed." So I went up. Eleanor sat with the moss green wool in her lap and said nothing at all, because there was nothing on earth to say, and she understood, in that moment, something about him she suspected no other living person understood. He had not failed to become master of that house. He had refused to, in case it proved a mistake, and the refusing had gone on so long it had become the house itself. "Your Grace," she said at last, "may I ask another question out of my place?" "You have asked for already." "Why are the clocks stopped?" He turned on the hearthrug and looked at her. "Because we stopped them, as is proper. And no one has since given the order to start them." "And who gives that order?" "Silence. The fire, the settling coal, 19 candles. The master of the house," said the Duke of Blackmo, "gives that order." At 11:15 the door opened 4 inches, and Lady Margaret Ashworth came into the drawing-room in her nightgown, hair down her back, feet bare. "Meg." He was on his feet. "It is 11. "I know. I heard the house." "You heard?" "There has been no talking downstairs since Mamma. Mrs. Winslow says the drawing-room is shut, and it is not shut. I came to see who it was." Eleanor set her work aside and rose. "It is only me, my lady. I am mending your pelisse." "At night?" "At night." The child crossed the cold floor and stood at Eleanor's chair, laid her hand on the moss-green wool, and stroked it once. "That is my green. I chose it." "You did." She stood there, asking for nothing, simply standing in a lit room past 11 at night, hand on cloth, fire burning, 2 grown people not sending her away. It was so plainly the best thing to happen to her in 16 months that Eleanor had to study her stitching very hard indeed. "Uncle." "Yes." "Is she coming again?" The Duke of Blackmar stood on his own hearthrug in his own house and did not answer for 4 full seconds. "I do not know," he said. "That is not for me to say alone." Meg accepted this, which told Eleanor a great deal about what the child had been told in her short life. "Good night," she said, and went, and they both listened to her feet climb the stairs without pretending otherwise. The house had no way of marking time. Eleanor had not understood, until she had sat 5 hours in that drawing-room, what stopped clocks truly do to a room. No quarter-hour, no chime at the half. The evening simply grows later, and one learns how much later only by watching the candles burn down. He took out his watch at some point after the child had gone, looked at it, said nothing. At last he stood. "Miss Ashcombe." She looked up, needle in hand. "It is midnight." "Then I am finished, Your Grace." 7 until midnight. He went out. She heard his boots cross the hall, and stop. Then a sound returned through the open door she could not place for a moment, because it no longer existed in that house, the small dry clatter of a clock case opening, and the ratchet of a key. 11 turns. She counted them without meaning to. Then the hall clock at Blackmar struck 12 for the first time in 16 months, into a house where every soul lay awake pretending to sleep. He came back and stood in the doorway, looking as though he had been running, though he had walked only 30 feet. "Stay," he said. Eleanor set her needle carefully into the cloth. "Your Grace." "Stay. On the 18th, when Whitmore comes, sit in that chair with your work, and let there be a sound in this house." He stopped himself, because he was the sort of man who could not leave an untrue thing standing even when it served him. "No, that is not all of it, and I would rather say it badly now than have you learn it later. I do not want you here for Whitmore." "Then for what?" "I do not know." That is the honest answer, and it is not a good one. I have had one evening in 16 months in which I was a man in a room instead of a thing in a house. When the clock struck, I found I would have given a great deal for it not yet to be midnight. He put his hand flat on the door frame. "Go home, Miss Ashcombe. Mrs. Winslow has your guinea, and the gig waits at the door." I have no right whatever to have said any of that, and I am aware of it. Eleanor rose. Her hands were quite steady, which surprised her, for nothing else about her was. "Your Grace, I will come on the 18th, for the fee." "No," she said, before he could speak, "not for the fee, and I would be obliged if you did not offer me one. A woman may be paid for an evening, or she may choose to give one. She cannot do both at once, and I find I would rather do the second." She was at the door before he spoke again. "Miss Ashcombe, thank you for the clock." "I did not touch your clock." "No," said the Duke of Blackmore. "You asked me who gives the order." Ravensmere had the story by Saturday, out of the Blackmore stables, as such things always travel, by way of a groom's sister in service with the Winterbournes. By Monday it had acquired the guinea, by Tuesday a great deal that had never happened at all. Mrs. Winterbourne came into the shop on Wednesday to cancel the police, perfectly pleasant about it. The pleasantness was the whole art of the thing. She stood at the counter in her good bonnet and said she had thought better of the colour. Of course she would settle for the cutting already done, and settle to the penny, never once glancing toward the workroom door where Eleanor stood with a hem over her arm. "The colour," said Mrs. Whitfield, once the door had shut. "Let it alone." "I shall not let it alone. That is 9 guineas walking down the market square in a bonnet I trimmed myself." She set both hands flat on the counter. "2 more will go this week. Lady Kitson will not, because Lady Kitson has never in her life done what Mrs. Winterbourne did first." "I will go," Eleanor said, standing in the middle of the shop. "Say you turn me off, and in 6 weeks it will be somebody else's turn to be talked of. Sit down, Eleanor Ashcombe, in my shop, which I have kept 22 years and buried a husband to keep." Her voice was not loud. "Do you know what your mother did for me in the winter of '97? I had the influenza and 4 gowns promised for the Hollowford ball. She sat 9 nights in that room with her own baby asleep in a drawer and never took a farthing beyond her wage. When I offered it, she said a thing I have remembered 20 years. 'You will want it more in the spring.' She straightened. 'You will not go. If 4 households leave me over a girl who sat in a room with her work, then let them leave. I shall be poorer, and I shall still have a shop, a name, and my supper. Now finish that child's police. It is due Friday, and it is the best thing you have made in 5 years." Eleanor went into the workroom, shut the door, and cried 90 seconds, quietly. Quietly was permitted. Mrs. Adelaide Cavendish came to Blackmore Hall on the 9th of November, by her right, and no one disputed it. The child's aunt, her only near relation on her mother's side, come every 6 weeks since the funeral in a hired chaise from Bath. A tall woman of 44 in expensive violet, with her sister's mouth and none of her sister's ease, married to a wine merchant of good Bath family, mistress of a house on a hill above the city, a woman with a life, as Wren had written with such painful accuracy. She found Eleanor in the north room, the child on a stool. "Aunt," said Meg, "this is Miss Ashcombe. She made Mamma's blue." "Did she?" Mrs. Cavendish stood in the doorway, gloves in hand. "Turn round, Nell." The child turned. The police finished that morning, moss green, the collar exactly right, the front edges falling straight as a plumb line. Mrs. Cavendish looked at her sister's daughter a long moment. Well, you are not to go to Bath in a black frock, at any rate. Go up to Millbrook now, my love, I want a word with this person. The child went the way children go when they have learned that person means the tone will shift the moment the door shuts. It did. I know who you are, Mrs. Cavendish said. You are the guinea. I am the dressmaker, You are the guinea, and you may spare me the modesty, for I have had it from 3 separate sources. She came into the room. Do you know what I have done these 16 months? Sat in that hall with the clock stopped and taken that child on my knee and asked what she has been doing, and she says nothing, aunt, because it is true. I have written to the Duke of Blackmore 11 times. He has answered 11 times, in 4 lines on the estate paper, always civil, always about arrangements, not one told me a single thing she said, or did, or wanted. She drew a breath. And now I hear that in October he sat 5 hours with a woman he paid, in the room where my sister used to sit, and talked as he could not do for me in 16 months, and I am her blood. Her voice cracked on the word, and she brought it back with visible effort. You may imagine how that struck me. His asking a hired woman to teach him how to be a father. That is a true thing put to a wrong use, Eleanor said. He did not hire me to teach him anything. He hired me because he was afraid he had forgotten how to be in a room, and wished to find it out on a Thursday with a dressmaker rather than on the 18th with a gentleman from London. She met the older woman's eyes. You have been honest with me. I will be honest with you. He did not choose me over you. He could not do it with you, because you are her blood, you are the whole of what happened, sitting in his hall every 6 weeks in your violet gown. I am nobody. That is my only qualification, and it is why it worked. The room went very quiet. Mrs. Cavendish turned to the window, gloves crushed in her fist. I buried 3 of my own, she said to the glass. 2 before a year old, and 1 at 4 days. I do not speak of it. I tell you only so you will not think me a woman collecting a child the way one collects china. A breath. I was not sent for. 2 men rode north that night, and nobody in this house sent a man west to me. I came on the Thursday because I read it in a Bath newspaper, in my own morning room. Her hand rose to her face a moment. He was in a field, Eleanor said. They sent to him because he was the heir, and there were papers to be signed. Nobody thought of the sister. That was not cruelty, That was a house with its head off. I am aware of what it was. It does not make the not being sent for any different, in the middle of the night, which is when such a thing returns. She drew her gloves on finger by finger, the way a woman ends a conversation she has decided has run far enough. I shall not withdraw. I am not a wicked woman, and I am not a fool. I believe that house will make that child a ghost, and I mean to prevent it, and I would rather be hated in 3 counties than stand one day at Meg's grave wondering if I might have spoken. On the 18th I shall be in that room, and I shall tell Mr. Whitmore the truth as I see it. I would think less of you if you did not, Eleanor said. At the door Mrs. Cavendish paused. You are not at all what I was told. That makes this whole business a great deal worse. He came to Ravensmere on the 11th, itself an event. The Duke's carriage stood outside the linen draper's a full quarter hour, and every soul in town found business at a window. Mrs. Whitfield glanced out once, went upstairs, and shut herself in the cutting room, the most useful thing anyone did that day. He asked Eleanor to walk with him, and they walked in full view along the churchyard path, where the whole town could see and none could hear. I have had Wren down. 3 days at the hall, reading the aunt's affidavit. Is it bad? It is accurate. That is what is bad about it. Every fact in it is true, and every conclusion wrong, and I am told that is the most dangerous kind of document there is. They reached the corner by the well. Wren says there is one answer, and says it as plainly as he says everything. The master will not take a child from a settled household, and a household is settled when there is a mistress in it. If I were married by the 18th, or under an engagement that could be sworn to, Mrs. Cavendish's case falls apart in a morning. Eleanor kept walking, because stopping would have been an answer of its own. "Miss Ashcombe." He stopped anyway. "Will you marry me?" The rooks went over the churchyard. She had thought of the possibility perhaps 8 days, the way one thinks of the sea without ever having seen it, never so far as imagining it beside a wall of yews at 2 in the afternoon. "Why?" she said. "Because it would settle the question of the child." He heard it as he said it. She watched him hear it. "No," he said at once. "That is not, it is what you said." "It is what I said." His hands came out from behind his back. "It is not untrue, and that is my difficulty. I have thought of nothing else 8 days, and cannot get the two things apart in my own head, and I will not stand in a churchyard and pretend to you that I can." "Then I will get them apart for you, since I have had less to think of." Her voice stayed perfectly level, her hands were shaking, so she put them behind her, and that was how they stood, 3 feet apart. "You want me because a house with a woman in it reads better in a report. And you want me because on a Thursday in October you found you could breathe. Both are true. Only the second is a reason to marry, and it is not the one you led with. Eleanor, do not. You have not called me that before, and if you do it now I shall not be able to say the rest." He shut his mouth. "I have spent my whole life," she said, "making things look as though nothing ever happened to them. I can take a gown that has been turned, stained, let out for a child, and send it into a ballroom looking like for guineas of new silk, and no woman in that room will find the mend. I will not be a mend, Your Grace. I will not be the thing you lay over the hole in that house so the gentleman from London cannot see it, because a mend holds for ordinary wear, and it goes the moment it is pulled. I told you that in the supper room at midnight, and you have not thought of it once since. That is not true. I have thought that I never in my life met anyone who says the actual thing. That I did not know I was lonely until a woman sat in my drawing room 5 hours with a piece of green wool. That when the clock struck 12 I stood in the hall with the key in my hand and could not make myself go back through that door, because going back meant it was over." His voice rose, he brought it down. "And that I am about to lose my brother's daughter, and cannot tell which of those two facts is making me say this so badly. Until I can, you are entirely right to refuse me." "Yes," said Eleanor. "I am." A cart went by on the far side of the wall, the carter watching them as long as his horse allowed. "I will not come on the 18th, she said. "You said you would." "I said it before all of Ravensmere knew what you had paid me, and before your solicitor decided the shape of your household was the whole case. If I sit in your drawing room with my work when Mr. Whitmore walks in, what does the aunt say? She says there she is, and she is not even lying. She straightened cuffs that did not need it. You will do it alone. Sit at that table from 7 until midnight with a stranger, and you will find you can, because you have already done it once. And if I cannot, the fault was never in the house," he said. "And you had better learn it before that child is old enough to be told about it." She left him standing in the churchyard, and got as far as the shop door before understanding she had refused a duke in front of the whole town. That would be the second story, and between the two of them her name would be spoken in Ravensmere for 30 years. She went in at the front, as she had been told, chin up. Mr. Whitmore came down on the 18th and was at Blackmore Hall by 6, a mild, grey, unhurried man of 50 who had done this work 30 years and long ago stopped being impressed by houses. He examined the child, the nursery, the accounts of what had been spent on her, asked Mrs. Winslow a great many questions, and wrote down the answers. At 7 they sat to table, Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Cavendish in her violet, the Duke of Blackmore in his own house. It went precisely as Nathaniel had known it would. He answered correctly in 4 or 5 words, exactly as he had answered 11 letters in 16 months, heard himself do it, and could not stop. Twice he began a sentence about his brother and set it down again. Mrs. Cavendish spoke well and quietly and without a trace of malice, which was infinitely worse than rage would have been. By 9 the whole table had settled into the particular silence Nathaniel had dreaded since the June before last, while beyond the door the hall clock's pendulum went on, patient as a heartbeat, marking off the length of his failure. At 20 to 10 there came a commotion in the hall. Eleanor Ashcombe had walked the 4 miles from Ravensmere in the dark with her work-box under her cloak, and came into the drawing-room with the hem of her skirt wet to the knee. "Miss Ashcombe," said Mr. Whitmore, rising, for he was a courteous man and did not yet know what she was. "Sir." She stood in the middle of the carpet. "My name is Eleanor Ashcombe. I am a dressmaker's hand at Ravensmere, and I made that child's clothes. In October the Duke of Blackmore offered me a guinea to sit in this room from 7 until midnight with my work, and I took it. Everyone in this county knows it, and you would have had it from somebody before your shoes reached the turnpike, so you may as well have it from me." Mrs. Cavendish had gone white. "I have no place here," Eleanor said. "I know exactly what I am. I have come because I am the only person alive who knows why he did it, and he will not tell you, because he does not know how to say a thing about himself in a room." "Miss Ashcombe," said Nathaniel. "Your Grace, I refused you in a churchyard in front of the whole town, and I have no interest whatever in your house. Let that answer for me." She turned back to Whitmore. "He did not hire a woman to put on a show for you. He hired a stranger to find out whether he could still sit in a room with one, because he had not done it since they brought his brother up out of the Ford. He stopped it at midnight, paid me, sent me home, then went into his own hall and wound the clock that had been stopped 16 months. Every servant in this house lay in bed and listened to it strike 12. The room was entirely still. "Sir," Eleanor said, "you have come to learn whether this is a fit house for a child. You are the only man in England who can make him say why it was not, until now. Ask him what he was waiting for." Whitmore looked at her a long moment, then sat, capped his pen, and said, "Your Grace." "What were you waiting for?" And Nathaniel Ashworth, at his own table, hands flat on the cloth, said, "For it to be a mistake." Nobody moved. "I did not stop the clocks. They were stopped for me, properly, as is done. But I never gave the order to start them, though I have known a full year that I alone could. I did not, because starting them made it true. My brother is dead. I am not the Duke of Blackmore by any right that makes sense to me. I have been this property's agent 16 months, and a good one. I have not once been master of this house. The master went into the Ford at Hollow Crossing, and I have been keeping his chair warm in case there had been some error." He looked up. "The child has grown 3 inches, and no one noticed until a dressmaker measured her. That is my case, sir, and it is not a good one. It was Mrs. Cavendish who made the first sound, very small." Eleanor crossed the room, took the marbled ledger from her box, and set it in the older woman's lap, open to the 4th page from the front. "That is your sister's blue." Adelaide Cavendish looked down at her fingers with the faded silk, put out one hand, touched the cording, read the 3 lines beneath it, and the 4th, written by a girl of 19 the November of that year. She took her own shawl off the chair and put it round my shoulders, because the room was cold. She always did that, Mrs. Cavendish said. All her life, to me, when I was, she did not finish. She sat in a strange drawing-room with her sister's gown beneath her fingers and wept without a sound, the way women of 4 and 40 weep in company. Nathaniel rose, went round the table, and set his hand on her shoulder, the first time in 16 months anyone in that family had touched anyone at all. The door opened for inches. Lady Margaret Ashworth came in over the cold floor, nightgown, hair down her back, and looked at the 4 of them. "There is talking downstairs," she said, and came the whole way in, past her uncle, past the gentleman from London, and stood at her aunt's knee, and laid her small hand flat on the open page, beside her mother's blue. Whitmore sat very still and wrote nothing down. He noted later, in a report still folded in a deed box at Blackmore Hall, that in 30 years at this work he had learned to distrust everything a house showed him after 7 o'clock, and had never before seen a whole question answered by a child crossing a carpet. The petition was never tried. Mrs. Cavendish withdrew it in January, on terms she wrote out herself, and they were not soft ones. Lady Margaret to go to Bath from the 1st of May to the end of July, every year, until she turned 17, and a letter every week from Blackmore Hall, not for lines on estate paper, but a true accounting of what the child had said and done and wanted, or Mrs. Cavendish would know the reason why. Nathaniel signed it without reading past the first clause. 3 months of every year, he never pretended afterward that it cost him nothing, and Eleanor loved him rather more for the not pretending than for the giving. He came to Ravensmere on the 4th of February, and this time did not ask her to walk where the town could watch. He came into the shop, removed his hat, and stood among the bolts of calico like any other man in the county. "It is settled. The child stays, the aunt is satisfied, my solicitor has gone back to London, and there is not one legal reason on this earth for me to be standing in this shop." Mrs. Whitfield went upstairs to the cutting room, making a great deal of noise on her way. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "there is no report now, and no gentleman coming, and nothing whatever left to be settled by it. Will you marry me?" Eleanor stood with her hands full of unbleached calico. "Say the reason." "Because I have been a man in a room with you, and I have not been a man in a room with anyone else since I was 25. Because you are the only person who ever asked me who gives the order. And because I would like, for the rest of my life, to walk into a room and find someone working in it. 1 second. 2. 3. "Yes," said Eleanor Ashcombe. They were married in April at Hollowford Church, in a gown she made new, of cloth Lady Margaret chose after 20 minutes of the most serious deliberation in England, not turned, not remade, but new, because she had spent 5 years making other women's old silk look like nobody's history, and would not be married in a mend. Some doors in that county never opened again. Mrs. Winterbourne fell conveniently ill for 20 years whenever the Duchess of Blackmore was expected, and 2 houses within 9 miles of the Hall never sent their cards. Eleanor found, to her own surprise, that this troubled her about as much as a flat cello. What she missed, and went on missing, was the workroom. She said so once at 40, and Meg laughed at her for it. Their son was born in March, in the room with the good north light, which had by then become the sewing room of the house, 14 girls in it of a Tuesday, learning fine work at 8 shillings the week. The white work in the old basket was never finished. Eleanor could have done it in an afternoon, and never did. It lies still in a glass frame in the upstairs passage, the needle in it, the thread gone brown, and beneath it, in a small hand, 3 lines and no more. Begun by Charlotte, Duchess of Blackmore, on the 12th of June. Was not finished. Is not to be. The clocks at Blackmore Hall are wound every Sunday morning, all 5 of them, by Lady Margaret when she is at home, because her uncle gave her the keys on her 10th birthday and never asked for them back. She winds the hall clock 11 turns, and lets no one else near the stable clock at all. And on Hallowtide night, the drawing-room shutters at Blackmore Hall stand open, candles in every window, and from the turn of the avenue the front of the house shows 2 squares of yellow light. The Duchess sits in the chair by the fire with her work and her branch of 3 candles at her left hand. There are 9 gowns in that house made by her own 2 hands, and 4 made twice over. She does not need to see them. She knows the sound of them. And there is not one soul beneath that roof who does not know her.